Hello.
Our story begins inside of Padme's apartment from across the city of the Jedi Temple. She could see the rising of a small cloud of smoke. Padme was standing alone, having just sent 3PO to find out where Anakin was, but she was getting impatient. The protocol droid would likely be searching for the best answer, which is fine. That could take longer than she wanted. Her emotions were rising, and she was feeling the pressure of the physical limitations of her pregnancy, but the concern of what would become of her husband and her friends concerned her. Padme turned towards the other side of the room and looked at her personal communicator. She tried contacting Anakin already, but it was turned off. She didn't expect any foul play because of that, but she was still worried. Another cloud of smoke started to rise from the temple, this one bigger than the last. She moved over to the other side of the room and grabbed the communicator. She called the temple and a youngling answered after her third attempt to call. She said that they were under attack and Padme asked, "By who?" Before the kid could say anything, she could hear crying. Within an instant, Padme's newly acquired maternal instincts kicked in. It no longer mattered who was there. She told the little girl that it would be alright, before the comms cut out. Naturally, Padme continued by contacting Captain Typho and telling him to round up as many guardsmen as possible. He informed her that Representative Binks moved a couple of them to a landing platform on the other side of the city. She was glad to see that Jar Jar was on top of things. She then asked that Typho find and bring as many Senate guards as possible. He didn't know what she was trying to do, but she quickly informed him that they were going to go to the Jedi Temple and see what was happening. She didn't want to go over empty-handed, especially if the Separatists were there. The situation seemed to be getting progressively worse. She quickly changed outfits and grabbed the blaster pistol so that she could be prepared for whatever challenges awaited her inside the temple. Padme was ready to go within minutes and met up with Captain Typho in her living room. He had a vessel prepared and they would go together. Typho wanted to know what she was planning on doing. Truthfully, she didn't know, but she was determined to make sure everything was okay. Typho nodded his head, and the two of them sped along to another landing platform where 24 Senate guards and another 24 Naboo security force troopers had met up. Everyone was on edge, but Typho quickly gave out orders as Senator Amidala entered the vessel. He knew she was hurting, and he didn't want her wasting any more of her energy. Quickly, the guard entered the ship behind her, following Typho's orders, and they left for the temple. The group of them will land on the landing platform and exit behind Padme and Captain Typho. Out of the thousands of people Padme interacted with, her security captain was well aware of her pregnancy. Where it came from, not as much, but for the most part he was up to date, so his main priority, as well as the main priority for his 3 most elite troopers, were to make sure she stayed safe no matter what. Due to the clones moving through the temple, a handful of men moved out to the landing deck where Padme's ship was. The Senate Guard and the Naboo security force stayed close to her as she walked forward to confront the clones on deck. Captain Typho had given his orders already. They were to avoid conflict until they confirmed their enemies. Everyone was on edge though. Why was the 501st here? All tasks on Coruscant were dealt with by the Coruscant Guard. A prime example of this was when the temple was bombed several months before this. Padme asked the troopers what was happening, and he told her that there had been a rebellion. She pressed further, asking what type, and they raised their weapons, telling her they were sorry but it was time for her to leave. Padme had never been afraid of a blaster before. She told the clone that she was a Republic senator. She deserved an answer so that she could best serve the people of this Republic. The clone hesitated, and then he told her and her unit that they had 10 seconds to leave the platform and the temple or they'd be fired upon. They were serving under the directive of Order 66, issued out by the Emperor. Padme knew something wasn't right. There were no emperors. She asked who this emperor was, and he told her that it was Palpatine, the one who issued the order. She should know that for a senator. He then started counting down. The guards behind her were stuck. They didn't want to fight the clones, but Padme wasn't backing down either. She told the troopers that there were no emperors in this republic. He was breaking the law, and she demanded once more to know the truth. Before the clones could fire, 2 guards pulled Padme to the side and Senate guards opened fire. They could see more reinforcements coming, and very quickly, the standoff turned into a firefight. Everyone's blasters were set to stun, of course, aside from the clones. But the Senate unit outnumbered the clones on the platform, which allowed them a chance to take minimal casualties before pushing forward. Captain Typho told Padme that she needed to go back to the ship, and she shook her head. She didn't become a senator to cower away from the first sign of danger. She was going, whether he liked it or not. Padme pushed past him and told the troopers to be careful. This unit of soldiers were under some sort of spell, and they happened to be one of the most elite units of clones in the galaxy. They understood and moved into the temple. Across the city, 3PO walked towards the window joyfully. He had received information on Master Skywalker. He was going to inform Padme of what had happened, and carry out other duties for her. Instead, the Golden Protocol droid started playing hide-and-go-seek with himself. Padme and her unit moved into the Jedi Temple with 37 men still alive. The others had been killed by precise shots of the clones. As they moved into the temple itself, they looked around. The bodies of dead Jedi littered the hallways. Padme was confused and terrified. A couple of the guards ran to their sides, checking for a pulse and feeling nothing. As they did, blaster fire erupted at them, as more clones came pouring down the hallway. Typho pushed Padme to the side as hard and gently as he could, ensuring not to hurt her. He kept her behind him as he fired away. Typho suggested they set their weapons to kill. If these clones were only stunned, then they would continue coming back. He apologized, knowing that she understood that these clones were human beings, but it was a risk they could not take anymore. One of the Senate guards was injured as he pulled behind a pillar. His comrade stood over him, firing away, while another applied bandages. Padme agreed, reluctantly, as Typho told them to set their weapons for kill. The clones who charged them were left in the hallways open, and as they fired, they were ambushed by a group of Jedi Knights. They were looking for an escape, but seeing the Senator reassured them that they were finally safe. Once the clones were dealt with, the young Jedi came over to the Senate guards and troopers. They asked why they were here, and Padme very quickly asked what was happening. The Jedi reported that Master Sinjalak was ambushed at the front of the temple, killed by a lightsaber. After that, the clones piled in. Many Jedi were sleeping, and those who weren't were only younglings, Padawans, teachers, or priests. No one was really prepared for this unit of clones. Padme asked who was the one that killed Sinjalak. They didn't know. They could only assume that it was the Dark Lord of the Sith. There were rumors that Master Shakti had been killed in her quarters by a lightsaber, but Masters Coleman Kaj, Tara Sanube, and Jocasta Nu had vanished. They also admitted that they hadn't seen the temple guards. They were locked down somewhere in the archives or something like that. Typho told the Jedi to stick close to them. They were here to recover any injured Jedi and figure out what was happening. The young Jedi welcomed themselves these new allies, as the unit moved forward away from the corridor they were in. Padme and Typho were at the front of the pack, but she was really struggling. The young Jedi felt terrible for her. They could feel the presence of children, and they were within her. It was a surprise no one else figured this out, but it was probably because she put on a mask when she was around others to cover it up. The physical exertion inside the temple just made it impossible to hide right here, let alone the stress of everything around them. Padme's unit came across more clones. Some of them were shooting already dead Jedi, and others were looking for more individuals to hunt for sport. The unit didn't really want to kill the clones, but there really was no other choice. It was like they were brainwashed. Padme began remembering what Anakin told her about Tup on Ringo Vinda, and she believed it was the same thing happening here. So in a way, she felt like she was helping liberate these clones from a terrible zombie-like haze that would kill them eventually anyways. Blaster fire passed by her, and her troops fired on the clones. Another couple of her unit were killed, but they pressed forward. She was losing track of the numbers at this point, especially because every other hallway, they added new Jedi to their ranks as well as lose more members of their unit. So for every Senate guard and Naboo security force they lost, they were replaced with a new Jedi. Didn't matter how old or young, they were building a force. It was almost a kryptonite for the clones, because their strategy had been hunting Jedi in pairs of 3 or 4, but when the Jedi were able to defend themselves while other human troopers fired at the clones, it made for an impenetrable barrier. But the clones were picking up wind of the Senator unit, so they were slowly converging on the area where they were. This made the already difficult and trying territory even more so. Padme and her unit of men, women, and Jedi got tied up in a hallway, surrounded by clones on both sides. The Jedi and troopers got to each other's side and fought together, but the clones kept on coming. Sure, they were losing more and more men, but they couldn't stop refilling their lines, unlike the Senators could. Padme and Typho were fighting side by side, shooting down these brainwashed clones, until one of the Jedi Knights called out with joy. It was General Skywalker. He had come to save them. But that didn't happen. He marched forward with a hood over his head, and his men moved out of the way for him, filling in the gaps behind him as they continued firing forward. Padme was facing the other direction before she felt the desire to turn when she heard General Skywalker called out by the Jedi. The same individual who identified Anakin was lifted off the ground and pulled into his hand, before Anakin's lightsaber was driven through his stomach and out his back. As Skywalker proudly pushed the limp body off his blade, he heard his name called by an all too familiar voice. Anakin looked up, and his pride turned to dismay as he yelled out, telling every trooper to stop firing. All the clones did so, and the Senate Guard did too. Everyone was confused, but it only allowed the tension to grow. Padme was so bewildered, she asked what he was doing. Anakin stumbled over his words. She shook her head. It was as if she had seen a ghost. Her eyes darted from the sides of the walls, which were littered with blaster holes, to the ground beside her where she saw a dead youngling. She took a closer look, realizing that the youngling was slain by a lightsaber. Her heart fell into the center of her stomach. She turned back to him with a broken gaze, one so tortured that it sent a crack right down the middle of his own twisted heart. Anakin realized what he was doing, but it was too late. Everyone watched as the domestic dispute was shared between everyone in the corridor. No one knew they were together, obviously, but it was the senator versus the general behind the attack. Padme asked why he would do this. They were his family. That wasn't entirely true, but despite all the bad memories he had, it wasn't worth this. Why would he do this? She pleaded with a broken voice, and he stood with a shadow of darkness lurking behind him. He didn't have an answer, not one that would make any sense. He told her that he was trying to save her. Padme broke. Her eyes filled with tears, and her voice shattered into a raspy array of cracks and rips. She yelled, demanding to know why he would do this again. Killing everyone on Tatooine didn't bring his mother back. Why did he think killing everyone here would save her from something that didn't happen yet? He was smarter than this. He wasn't dull. Why? Just why? Padme grabbed her chest and took a deep breath. Captain Typho came up from behind her and asked if she was alright. Her eyes closed as she rubbed them with the edge of her sleeve. She looked back to Anakin and asked again, why? He didn't have an answer, so she gave him one. Did he think any of this would impress her? It scared her bad enough when he did this the first time. It almost caused a divorce when someone forced themselves onto her while they were hiding their marriage. What did it take for him to understand that she feared this side of him? Did it take her walking away for him to finally realize and get it? Anakin shook his head and told her he could not lose her. She was everything to him. He did this to protect her, to save her. Padme's tears stopped, with one more falling silently on her red cheeks. Padme looked at him, squinting her eyes, with her eyebrows lowered. She told him that he did lose her. Not because of a nightmare, but because he couldn't just look at what he was doing and see how terribly wrong it was. Why would he convince his men to do this, especially after top in 5s? Padme realized there was something more than brainwashing here, especially after seeing Anakin, but she continued further and asked how any of this was supposed to save her. Killing children when he was about to become a father didn't save anything. She looked down and told him that she should have stayed away. She never should have let her emotions get the best of her after what she saw on Tatooine. The last thing she said is that Anakin's mother, that sweet, beautiful, and enchanting woman from Tatooine, would be so disappointed to see what her son had become. The corridor fell silent, and then from around a corner a bundle of Jedi slammed their blades into the back of a clone unit, looking at Padme's unit. Typho grabbed her and pulled her back, telling the troopers to move out. He could tell that she was getting weak, and this emotional whirlwind wouldn't be good for the pregnancy. This unit of Jedi was Temple guards. They escaped Grand Inquisitor. Typho told them to get back to the ship. The guards couldn't do that, but the other Jedi did. As they made their move, the clones surrounding Skywalker moved around him and attacked, some of them being killed in the process. Anakin just looked down, the final words echoing from one ear of his head to the other. He looked down at the Jedi he had just slain, and he choked up. They were in his class. They hadn't gotten along when they were younger, but as they grew up, the individual apologized for his rudeness during their adolescence. Anakin accepted the apology, and the two of them even played a couple games of sabacc with each other while watching pod races with a couple other Jedi. They weren't best friends, but they also weren't mortal enemies. Anakin felt so much shame, and from the corner of his eye, he felt the lifeless gaze of a youngling looking at him. Anakin's head turned and his heart shattered. The younglings, what did they do to deserve this? Padme was right. Now the question loomed on his mind. Was he a monster? Looking around him, it seemed as if he was. In an effort to try and stop the carnage, he told the troopers to call off their assault, but that didn't happen. The chips were active, and despite him not being a Jedi, he was now an agitator. He went from an ally to an enemy with the slip of a couple words, and they went out to every trooper inside the temple. Anakin didn't realize this until he was clipped in the shoulder by a clone trooper. He turned back and defended himself, fending off the attackers. Skywalker's fight had come full circle, as he started to incapacitate his own men. Padme, on the other hand, was limping while holding her stomach. She was with a bundle of Jedi, as one of the Jedi priestesses came up to her and told her to be still, as the two of them bundled together between pillars with blaster fire flying by them. The Jedi priestess lowered Padme to the ground and held her stomach with her hand. She closed her eyes and transferred a little bit of life essence and calming energy. It was a lot, especially for a priestess, but she could see that Padme was really struggling. The physical turmoil was putting her over the edge, but the simple act of kindness may have saved a few lives. Whether that be of the twins or Padme was undecided at the moment. The Senate force continued fending off clones as the Jedi continued grouping up. Having the Temple guards with them was now a game changer. They were some of the most elite troopers in the Temple, having learned from Sindralik himself. The Senate unit picked up and they moved forward, continuing the move throughout the temple until they got to the landing docks and escaped. The temple guards would stay behind. There were still more troops inside the temple that needed to be dealt with. Their only objective was defending the lost Jedi. Typho ordered the pilot across the city. Many of the troopers and Jedi were injured. They would be taken care of, hopefully. Padme especially needed medical care, as a few Jedi priests and priestesses gathered up with her and gently pressed their hands against her stomach, calming her nerves and taking her pain away from her. It was the least they could do, especially because she helped save them. If Padme wasn't there, they'd likely be dead. The fight was terrible. At least some remnant of their order would still be preserved. The sick irony of Padme's arrival is that for Anakin, he'd be seen in two different perspectives. Some Jedi would see him as the hero, General Anakin Skywalker fending off his own men to save the temple, while everyone else would see him as the monster he was for what he did to their friends, brothers, and sisters. The worst part for him is the fact that the most important person in his life had the real perspective, the one he didn't want her to have. He knew he would have lied about the entire thing because she would have never supported it, but now the truth was exposed. Once the clones had been dealt with, Skywalker applied a back-to-patch to his shoulder and made his way across the city. He didn't care anymore. He saw the horror on Padme's face, and that alone would haunt him for a lifetime. He had seen her reaction after killing the Tusken Raiders. He had seen her disappointment after obliterating Rush Clovis. Now he had seen her pure fear of him. If he died, he would die for her. He would die to make things right, and he would make the sacrifice to make sure his child had a better life than whatever Sidious had planned for the galaxy. As Anakin landed at the executive building, after protecting the temple, he slaughtered Commander Fox and a couple other guardsmen. He didn't want any distractions. He didn't care if they were clones. They were traitors, just like him. Skywalker left a message behind in the temple, telling whoever was in charge of the temple that the CIS leaders were on Mustafar, and Palpatine was a Sith Lord. He apologized for his actions, and he promised to make everything right. As he got closer to Palpatine's office, he used the Force to choke out two royal guards before entering. Sidious was surprised to see Anakin, but Anakin didn't show any excitement to see him. There was evil in Skywalker's eyes. Sidious thought to himself, perfection. He did it. No matter what happened next, Anakin was his, a Sith. Skywalker told Sidious that he had a debt to pay, and Sidious smiled and asked what that might be. Anakin told him that he was going to pay for manipulating him. As it turns out, Skywalker did some soul-searching during his trip from the temple to here. He realized that if Palpatine was Sidious, and if Sidious was Palpatine, then he was behind everything. The clones, the Clone Wars, the attacks on Padme, literally everything. So, with that newly unveiled knowledge, he realized that Sidious had been trying to kill Padme for years, and that was something he would pay for with his life. Palpatine kinda just laughed it off. Who cares? Skywalker wasn't powerful enough to kill him. The Jedi were gone, and the Republic was his. Who cares? Anakin ignited his lightsaber and raised it. Sidious smiled and did the same. This would be fun. Their blades slammed together in the middle of the room. Sidious was using his second blade because the other hadn't been found yet. Anakin was powerful, but that shot to his shoulder was acting up. The two of them toiled back and forth, Skywalker pressing as hard as he could. Sidious was taking it easy, but Anakin wasn't. He was channeling the dark side and using every move to his advantage. Sidious just had age on him and experience. His strength was knowledge, and Skywalker had only just begun his journey down the dark path. He was excited to use his powers, but they paled in comparison to Sidious's. The Dark Lord shoved Anakin back and pushed an assault against him. Skywalker realized in this moment that Sidious wasn't just any opponent. The two of them moved like they were in a dance, both pushing for more control over the other, each of them trying to achieve victory. Anakin felt a seize of power. There was no question he was physically stronger, but Sidious was as quick as Yoda, and Anakin wasn't there yet. As Anakin jabbed forward, he felt Sidious pull his arm forward. It felt like Anakin had won, but he'd given up all of his power. Sidious slid under Anakin and dragged his lightsaber across Anakin's left arm, ripping the entire arm off. Anakin cried out in agony as Sidious shot lightning into Anakin's chest, throwing him across the room. He looked up and winced in pain. He moved his hand over and felt where his arm was missing. He now no longer had either of his original hands. He looked at Sidious with rage in his eyes, and Sidious lowered his weapon, asking if he was upset. The tone was nothing but regretful in a way. Sidious had a way with his voice, as if he felt bad for Anakin or even pitied him, but he was just taunting Skywalker to use the dark side, telling him that no matter what, he would never win this contest. Anakin got up and reached out his hand. The lightsaber slowly lifted off the ground before being pulled into his hands. He ignited the weapon. Sidious smiled, and Anakin pulled it to his chest, taking a deep breath. before leaping across the room. Their blades connected again. The Dark Lord backed up, and Anakin thought he pushed Sidious, and he lunged. As Sidious dragged his lightsaber across Anakin's abdomen, he dropped to the ground, his skin crawling with the burning sensation of heat. This was pure agony. There was nothing worse than this, and Sidious smiled, dragging his lightsaber across the ground, telling Anakin that he had so much more potential. The life of Darth Vader would have been one of power, strength, and control. Now, he wasted all of it, because he was stuck on his own attachments. Foolish boy. Sidious stopped right in front of Anakin and knelt down, asking Anakin if he had any final words before it was off with his head. Anakin panicked, looking for anything. He was holding his abdomen and couldn't hold himself upright anymore. He was bent over with Sidious preparing to execute him. Sidious told Anakin that he couldn't win this. Anything he did would result in more pain for himself. So, as a suggestion, he told Skywalker to sit still so that his execution would go by easily. Anakin searched, and then he found it. Sidious raised his blade and prepared to drop it. Anakin grabbed his lightsaber, and Sidious went to strike his hand, but he pulled backwards, striking his boot around and then kicking Sidious's kneecap backwards. That was a pleasant thought. Anakin pulled his lightsaber around, using his other foot to keep Sidious's hand away from him. The final shot was Anakin's lightsaber just piercing Sidious's evil heart, and the crimson blade not more than a couple inches away from landing the killing blow on Anakin. Across the city, the Jedi, Senate Guard, and Senator were escorted away from the planet. The medical complex complied, but they had to make sure they got out of there before the clones came for them. Despite the temple being cleared and the executive building going into lockdown, there was no saying if the Coruscant Guard would come for them. The unit was taken to Naboo, and the temple would be cleaned up. Luke and Leia were born, and Padme was alright. Anakin was unconscious in the Emperor's office, and everything was a mess. The next month of Padme's life would be as confusing as it was painful. Despite the war coming to a complete close, the Senate was a mess as well. No one knew what happened to Palpatine, including senators. Jar Jar was taking up Padme's responsibilities and being guided by Bail, Mon, and Rio. Padme was understandably taking things slow. She did keep an eye on the news, but there was nothing from the Jedi. Aside from the fact that the Jedi who survived and came with her to Naboo didn't know anything either. Those who she helped save and helped save her stayed with her. It was an enclave of 11 Jedi. They were in contact with Coruscant, but they didn't know anything. Everything in the galaxy felt still. The CIS leaders were found and were going through trial. The CIS government surrendered, and all that was left was, what next? No one knew. They assumed that everything would come crashing down into a bundle of chaos, and it didn't. Instead, the war ended and diplomacy resumed. But there was an eerie amount of unknowns. What ifs, if you will. So stupid. Padme by this point assumed Anakin died, because there was nothing from the temple on Coruscant about him. Ahsoka had survived, and she was one of the 11 Jedi here on Naboo. She was very worried, and despite the horrifying reality of her master's betrayal, she didn't want to leave Padme behind. Curiosity killed a loth cat, and she didn't want that curiosity to get the best of her, especially not with Maul on the loose and possibly coming for Padme. It was all such a mess, until one day, when Padme was out with her children, she saw a shuttle land. It was a Jedi shuttle. All she knew was Master Kenobi was coming by. He had assumed the role of Master of the Order, so he was very busy. But the month between everything happening was just bad timing. He couldn't get here to see her. He had reached out and spoke to her, but he never said anything regarding Skywalker. He wasn't allowed to. When they arrived, she saw not just Obi-Wan, but Anakin walking side by side. The 11 Jedi present were very on guard, but Kenobi calmed their hearts. He wasn't pleased with Anakin either, not in the slightest, but he was at the very least apologetic. A little too apologetic even for Anakin. But that was better than not being at all. The Jedi could kind of forgive. Not entirely, but kind of. As Jedi, they had to let go, not seek revenge, which was very hard for some of the younger Jedi who were traumatized by the events of Order 66. But Yoda was doing a phenomenal job at helping them find strength in their greatest challenge. Regardless, Anakin was sporting a new arm, and he had a couple of prosthetics around his waist and abdomen. They weren't permanent, just there until they fully healed. Padme and Ahsoka were sitting with each other, and when they saw Anakin, the disgust on their face couldn't be more identifiable. Obi-Wan understood. He wasn't here to take Anakin's side. Truthfully, he was here for Ahsoka and Padme. He wanted to make sure they would be okay. They were. He also told them that he would stay for a couple days just in case. If they didn't want Anakin, he'd be brought back to Coruscant. The Jedi didn't seek revenge, but he'd be put into carbon freezing and stay in it for 150 years as punishment for his actions. That'd give Grogu time to grow up and become able-bodied in case Anakin was still vengeful. Padme basically had the final say in if that was something she wanted Anakin to endure or not, because Skywalker, despite the good he did, was removed from the Jedi Order, because the bad was terrible. It would take some time, and it would take a lot of back and forth within her head and in conversations with Ahsoka, Obi-Wan, and the other 10 Jedi. But at the end, Padme would decide to keep Anakin here on Naboo. The issue for her wasn't that she didn't love him. Something about her just loved the toxicity, but it was about what he had done. However, Padme didn't want him to go into carbon freezing. She believed he could make up for his wrongs, but it wouldn't be overnight. Obi-Wan respected her decision, and as did the other Jedi. Kenobi would take the other 10 back to Coruscant. The Order was relocating. With the war over, their duty had been served. Aside from eventually taking down Crimson Dawn, the Republic was going to pay for them and all their troubles, but no amount of credits could undo what had been done. Skywalker felt so much pain from it. He had raging nightmares because of what he did to all those younglings. Anyways, Kenobi returned with the Jedi so that they could remove themselves and go to Ahch-To, and find their roots again. Padme was eternally grateful for the Jedi that stayed with her in her time on Naboo. They had the same gratitude for what she had done for them inside the temple. It was a confusing time. Initially, Padme didn't allow Anakin anywhere near the children, which she respected. Ahsoka did stay with Padme so that she could support her friend. Padme and Ahsoka became very close, and Padme even saw Ahsoka like her eldest daughter, which was something that Ahsoka cherished. Their time together would be strength, support, and love that both of them needed in such a hard time. Of course, Padme's family was very supportive of her, but to have someone as close as Ahsoka was, helping Padme with everything, made her feel a sense of comfort that she didn't know how to feel after Order 66. Though, Ahsoka was helping Padme with something else. The 10 Jedi that had recently left noticed it too, but the pregnancy gifted Padme powers she never had before. While it wasn't a lot, it was more than she originally had. Padme was able to wield the Force for the first time. She could move objects and pull them towards her, and Ahsoka was aiding her with her lessons in the Force. It brought the two of them together, but this gift of the Force was also what would save a broken relationship. Padme and Anakin were made for each other, in a way, and they could both feel each other's pain more than ever before. Anakin could always feel this, but now Padme was experiencing emotions on a heightened level. This didn't make her any more trusting of him, but it just allowed them to become closer and closer emotionally through the Force. Padme and Ahsoka spoke on it almost every night. The difference is Padme was noticing every day and all that came with it. Ahsoka was simply guiding her friend through it, and this helped Padme find a sense of peace within herself. Anakin wasn't living in the main building. He had gone out and built himself a small abode and was learning how to forgive himself with R2. And he was also learning how to love himself again, or even for the first time. This period of separation physically, but connection to the Force, gifted Padme and Anakin a new sense of understanding of themselves and of each other. Ahsoka, after a couple months, would have enough heart to speak with Anakin, and the change he had gone through was honestly inspiring. His self-sacrifice at the end of all of his mistakes helped him forgive himself, but he honestly wanted to do more, something to make sure he righted every wrong. So, he would leave Naboo. Not something he did in spite of the lack of communication between he and Padme. He just honestly left so that he could help other people. After about a year and a half of being away, he and Padme would have a chance to rekindle their love. It wouldn't be easy, and it would take a lot of time for her to see him in this new light and trust him. But her connection to the Force really aided her in taking the right steps into rebuilding their relationship. She just didn't have trust in him anymore. She could feel his motivations, and she could sense that he truly full-heartedly was invested in being his best self. But it would take time for her to trust him again. This would allow for Luke and Leia to grow up with both their parents. Despite the Jedi not being active in or around their lives, they'd have Obi-Wan and Ahsoka as aunt and uncle. It was a solid little family. Of course, who can't forget Uncle Rex, who called Naboo home after fighting for clone rights in the Republic. He, of course, won those fights in the Senate. The tragedy of Order 66 would never leave Padme and Anakin, but as they got older, they'd be glad it didn't, because it meant that as Luke and Leia took on the galaxy, they wouldn't have to face the same burden and suffering that their parents went through, and because of this rebirth of the relationship, they could also have a strong and united family in this new galaxy, And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to Benjamin Wells, Jango Fett Clone, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Grandaddy Bane, Laliand, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewo 670, Anakin Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Sith Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Cali, Gunley 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Fortis League Star Wars, Airbus, Rex Wolf, Man 3 First Names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and then before supporting the channel, smash that like button. Support me in other ways, go check out the Patreon. This really cool thing just dropped. I'm going to be showing off the animation soon. Super stoked about that. Otherwise, let's talk about this story. So, I wanted to have the pressure of Order 66 and the effect of Anakin's actions on Padme. They almost killed her, but there were people there to protect her. The one thing that I think is a saving grace for this scenario, and the one thing that really saves Anakin in this relationship, is the fact that Padme adopts the Force from Luke and Leia. I think in a scenario where she doesn't get the Force back, I think she would never want to see him again. But in a scenario where she could feel him and understand him in a different way through the Force, I think that's a scenario where they could come back and actually be a married couple and raise their children together and actually have a happy ending. So that's kind of what I wanted to go with here. I hope you all enjoyed though. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.